All right, so the nature of this conversation is for you guys to ask questions. And so there's a few ways that we can do this. In the app itself, I have added a question saying, hey, do you have any questions for these speakers? So just add your questions in the comments, and I'll be checking them as we go along. But I'll kick things off just to start, maybe with Merci. So the ideal product manager lives within some sort of Venn diagram of, business and technical and design. So how does one hire a team of ideal product managers when it gets so complicated in which everybody is in a different field, if that makes sense?
I think the most important thing. Am I now speaking close enough to the? Okay. I think the most important thing is PMs need to be relentlessly curious and able to learn really quickly. So one of the things that's really important sort of from any discipline is someone who isn't afraid of being wrong. And in an interview process, if they make a mistake and they say, oh, well, I think it would be X, Y, Z, and you say, oh, no, actually we've seen, it's B, C, D. If they lean forward and they're like, oh, really? How did you end up finding that out? That's the kind of person that you want, as opposed to someone who feels at all embarrassed for having been wrong.
And just kind of scooting off that a little bit, if you pardon me using the word scooting. I don't even know where it came from.
Is that a better word?
I don't know. It's an Irish word. Get away with it. So how important is it for that product manager to have technical abilities?
It totally depends on the product, I think. If you are a developer tool, then it's important, I think, for someone to have been an engineer. One, they're going to really understand the customer and really feel what those pain points are. And then two, just probably you need them to be able to understand it at the level of an engineer, at the level of your customer. Whereas if you're building a consumer product, someone who has a design background is probably going to be a great fit because they're really used to watching people use software and being able to predict how people are going to use it and deliver a really great user experience.
All right, so we're also gonna have a roving microphone, so get those questions brewing in your brain and your hands ready to be raised in a moment. But first, Ash, jobs to be done. When I first started following your work, there was no mention of jobs to be done. And since then, we've had Bob Messa speak here multiple occasions, and I've had the opportunity to become very familiar with the framework. How much of an impact has that jobs to be done had on your work and the way you look at your work?
Yeah, so I think a lot of people who stumbled into it probably found out through the milkshake study, and that's how I got first exposed to it. And it's a bunch of interesting ideas, but didn't know, how to really apply it. And then, funny enough, you mentioned Bob Moesta, but he shows up. He comes and says, "I've been trying to get this thing out there, but I struggle with explaining it to people because it's, as I said, it feels a lot like magic. I tell people how this works, and people say, "Oh, that's amazing. How do I do it?" It's like, well, it's a bit complicated. So he came to me, and so we decided we'll do some collaboration. He liked the work that I'd done with running Lean and Lean Canvas, and one of the things that I do, and I think I saw some of that in the Twitter stream, is I don't necessarily create original ideas. I mean, some are original, but I take things that are out there and try to make them simple or try to refine on them or optimize them. And so he came to me and said, I want you to do that with jobs to be done. So let's do a workshop together. I want you to show you everything that I'm doing. And that's how I got plugged into it. And the more we worked together, as you're describing, I got to see the power of the framework. And over the last few years, I've just been noodling over it and coming up. But it's definitely influenced a lot of the newer direction. And I like to call it the prequel to running Lean or Lean Startup, is that before you can get to running experiments, you have to start with good assumptions. You have to start with a good model. And if that's flawed, then yes, you can oftentimes pivot, but many times you just get stuck and you just prove to yourself quickly that this will never work.
Question from the audience, please. Yeah, right in the front row.
Okay. Hi. I really liked your talk, so that was really, thank you for that.
Thank you.
It's been on my mind about triggers. So your trigger point thing triggered a thing, no bad pun, but anyway. What if the trigger point ends up changing the business model completely? So for instance, it could be a direct to consumer, but the trigger point is going to make it a direct B2B2C product, for instance.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the short answer is you would then probably explore changing the business model. So the whole, I guess a lot of what we talk about when I use the word model is that if we think like scientists try to explore the world by building models, and then they make predictions, and if that prediction doesn't come true, they adjust the model. It's never really the experiment's fault, it's the model's fault. So if you're discovering that the trigger you thought was the one that would be actionable ends up being something different, then maybe you revisit the model, or you search, and sometimes there are multiple triggers. So this is where it could also be a case of there are two sets of triggers, and so I would just, on a case-by-case basis, explore further and see which is the case.
Thank you. I have a question from the app. Anna Smith asks you, Victoria, or you mentioned building trust early with your new hires and asking them for feedback. How do you get candid feedback from them on an ongoing basis?
Being very consistent is how you get candid feedback. So one of the things that I would do at the end of every meeting, so this is like a meeting with my Scrum team or a meeting with the product team, is ask for feedback on that meeting. And the first time that I did it, people are like, it was good, I guess. I don't know. Because no one wants to, like, tell you something that, like, you may not want to hear. And so I would lead by being critical of my own meeting and say something like, okay, well, I had a half an hour on the books for this. The content only took 15 minutes, so I probably should have canceled this meeting. None of it was time pressing and moved it to the next one. And then, it's Brene Brown is someone who's really inspired me in leading by vulnerability, because if you're willing to criticize yourself, other people are willing to criticize you too, and that's actually what you want. And then always consistently asking your direct reports, letting them own the agenda for the one-on-one, and then if they're just sort of like updating you, let them know, hey, like, is there anything I can do differently, start doing or stop doing, or any way that I can help you? So being really consistent and being candid about your own thoughts, I think, helps other people open up.
Do we have a question over here? Yeah.
Merci. Oh, there we go. That's very close. So as you thought about building out your product organization, so one on career pathing. So how do you think about a product manager's future over a 5-6 year period? How do you walk them through that? And then as Slack evolved, how do you think about grouping product managers across different functional areas? So you're responsible for this, you're responsible for that, and how did that evolve over time?
Great question. So on the first one, in terms of helping people sort out their career, one of the things that I tell people is they don't want you to win, DJ Khaled's, because it's true. You're the only person who gives a shit about your career, right? I'm here to help you be successful at Slack, but ultimately what you want in your future is up to you. So I will talk with people about whether they want to start a company someday and some of the skills that are required there. And then, if you want to advance within a particular organization, some of the skills that are required there. And I would often also help people create the relationships that move them forward. So I'm just one person, and I can help you do the things, get better at the things that I'm already good at. But I would connect people within the organization and say, oh, the guy who runs our search learning and intelligence organization in New York, who used to be the head of product at Foursquare, is a great product thinker who I go to for advice. So set up a skip level with him and go talk to him every 6 weeks. He's a great guy. People who are influential in your organization actually have more time than it seems like they would for doing things like that. And then I forgot your second question. Oh, functional roles? Yeah. Awesome. Oh, yeah, so the second question was around how do you group product managers around functional roles? So one of the things that I did when I was running the growth team is we all had shared metrics around activated teams. So we shared the one North Star metric, that corresponded directly to Slack's North Star metric around WAU growth or DAU growth. And then past that, each of the sub-teams ultimately had that same metric, which was, for us, the rate of activated teams, what percent of teams came in and reached a certain threshold of users and messages. And then I divided the team around specific customers. So one of the PMs on my team owned the team creator person, because we found that that was a pretty different person than the person who's joining a 100-person team. They have different needs, and they're really that early adopter. They tended to be basically a younger engineer. And then I had someone on the team joiner experience, and then someone else on paid conversion. The person who actually ends up converting the team is often not even someone who really uses Slack on a day-to-day basis. And I am a customer-obsessed person who worked at a customer-obsessed company. And so I think that's like reflective both of my values as a manager and what I think makes someone a great PM, but also reflective of the things that Slack really values, so that my PMs were learning not just how to get great at understanding that customer, but how to get great at working at Slack specifically.
Thank you. Thank you. I've got a question from Ash, and then we'll go to the audience again. From Peter Huseman. What's the ROI comparison for focusing on acquisition versus retention? And does focusing on acquisition help more with identifying the trigger events?
What was the first part? What's the...
So what's the return on investment
okay.
comparison for focusing on acquisition versus retention, if that makes sense to you?
So it's going to change at different points in the product. I like to think of it as a 10x model. So at the early stage, we aren't trying to really drive lots of retention because we don't have any customers. So in the beginning, it's really about how do I go from 0 to 1? So how do I get that first customer? We then start getting into repeatability. So that's when we start to see some product market fit. Then we get into growth, which is how do I go from that 1 to many? So the question is always going to be a function of the stage you're at, the life cycle you're in. A good way to kind of think of where you prioritize is really applying some systems thinking. Because if you focus on just one metric, if you focus just on driving acquisition, you can get your marketers to pump in a lot of leads, for instance, that maybe get people in the door, or your salespeople to close a bunch of sales. But if they aren't the right types of customers, then guess what? They're just going to tank. So to me, I try to think of it more from the overall throughput of the entire system. So we want to have happy, retained customers at the end of the day, and that's what you want to keep in sight. So the balance will shift over time, whether it's acquisition or retention, and sometimes looking at your funnel or looking at your customer factory, as I like to describe it as a system, helps you understand where your biggest constraint is now. So if you're getting people signing up but they're not activating, that could be where your bottleneck is. If they are activating but then leaving and not coming back, then retention becomes the bigger place to focus in on. And so it moves around. It's a lot like a tube of toothpaste. You know, you fix one problem and then the problem shifts elsewhere. So it's a continuous process, really.
I like that analogy. Yeah, very big, very frustrating for me. Question from the audience, please. I got you there, and then we'll go there and we'll go there. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So this is a what if you don't have question for both of you, right? So, Merci, if you don't have the customer-obsessed company that you work at, how do you get buy-in? And Ash, if you don't have the customer personas, how do you identify the right customers for jobs to be done interviews?
That's a great question. I think it really goes to the fact that storytelling is a really important part of being a product manager. So you can be quietly the customer-obsessed person, and then every story that you're telling leadership and every story that you're telling your team is referencing data because they care more about data than about user interviews, or they care more about the business use case. So it's knowing your audience and saying what it takes in order to get their approval for the thing that you know, because your customer obsessed really needs to happen.
And so going to the questions about personas, so the point that I was trying to make is that in the beginning, so it's a function of stage. So in the beginning, when you have no customers, trying to build a rich persona can lead you sometimes down the wrong path because you think you were going after this customer versus the other. And you sometimes fall into that local maxima, trying to optimize for one type when there's a bigger mountain that you miss. So that's where I said strip everything down, just use a label. So let's take the product or solution we have, go to that bigger context. So let's use labels like photographer or entrepreneur. I work with a lot of entrepreneurs. If you use product manager, you can look around and it's not gender specific, it's not age specific. So I couldn't even build a persona of a product manager or an entrepreneur these days because they can come from many different places. But what is common about them is there often are a few triggering events. So for an entrepreneur, it might be getting hit with this idea, maybe it was driving on the highway, maybe it was in the shower. They decide to do something about it. So I would go to what they do afterwards. Maybe they come to an event, maybe they go to a meetup group, and that's where I go find my early adopters, my early customers. Now, once you have customers, now you have a gift. You can, again, start to talk to them and study them. And even there, I would still hone in on what caused them to come to you and build up a persona from there. So again, a lot of shopping, buying experiences go into this is this kind of a shopper or that kind of a shopper. That requires a lot of research and maturity, and maybe you get to that point one day, but I would still caution just starting with the fewest attributes possible and then layering only as needed.
Thank you. Right over there, yep. Where's our rover? Yep.
Hi, I'm a part of the product team at Walmart e-commerce. My question is for Merci. What kind of weightage do you give to a candidate's prior product portfolio during the recruitment process?
What kind of weight do I give to the prior product experience that they have? It really depends sort of what the needs of the team are. And one of the things that hiring managers can do is make space for more junior people on the team. But being aware that they really have the time to do that mentoring. When we're building, it's sort of, as you go more toward specific skill sets, as your company is growing or you're hiring the 20th person onto a team, then I find that their previous experience matters a lot more. So I hired Paul Rosania from Twitter, where he had worked on the timeline. He's now the head of core product at Slack, and the product problem that he solved during his interview, and he did better than literally anyone had ever done, was around answering the replies question. And then, to no one's surprise, I was like, welcome to Slack, guess what you're building? Replies, because he was very familiar with that use case and all of the really interesting sort of ways that can change. And he was really one of the first people who I sought out to say, okay, your prior experience really matters because I need someone who I know is going to totally nail this. And Twitter's timeline and the Slack scrolling messages have a lot more in common than they have differently. But then it's also really great to be able to make space for more junior people who have almost no prior experience and then hire them for things like grit and ability to learn.
I'll just jump into there with a question from the app from Gibson Biddle. He's essentially saying that there's companies out there like Google who have a ponderously long hiring process, but we're often encouraged to hire slow and fire fast. Yeah. How do you exactly do that, and how fast are you really at doing that?
At firing people?
No. How do you? Yeah, that's the bad side of it. But how do you hire properly, and dispose is a horrible word as well. But dispose
That's
of...
a lot darker than fire. That's like dispose of the body.
Well, but you're going to keep your team lean. So how do you do
Yeah.
that, and how do you do it fast and efficiently?
To hire people or to...
Yeah, keeping your team lean by
Yeah.
keeping it high quality, hiring in a way that makes sense, and firing in a way that makes sense.
Yeah, so trying not to over-hire can be actually weirdly more difficult when you are in a position where you have enough money to hire another person and you're being pushed to grow the team. And you really want to be sure that you are growing in a reasonable way. So I think people should wait until their PMs are actually really overloaded. Again, I'm a total startup kid, an early stage startup kid at that. So I think your minimum day is a 10-hour day. That's working full time for me. Not an 8-hour day, it's a 10-hour day. If you're in the office 14 hours a day, I probably need to, and you're doing great work, I probably need to hire someone else. And for there to be actually a real role for them. So you might be spending your time on a bunch of different stuff, but is that all really necessary stuff? And what would you hand off to someone else in order to say, okay, there is a complete person's worth of work here, and especially for product, we have engineering, design, data analytics support, where you're not going to come in and be totally on your own or not totally on your own for a while. And so I think, putting off hiring people is one of the ways that you hire more slowly, and then really involving everyone in that decision, and then doing a lot of weekly check-ins with your reports and really trying to assess whether they're performing or not, and being very realistic with yourself about that.
Well, maybe I'll just ask you a question. How quickly do you fire people?
As soon as I'm pissed off. No, I'm just kidding. Firing people sucks, but as soon as you think that you have to, get it over with. It's obviously it's worse for them. It also sucks to be the person who's firing someone and who has to sort of bear that weight. But after, oftentimes people will come to you because a PM is a very cross-functional role, or they're not, delivering. And so being really candid with them that they're not performing and giving them a chance to do better is really important. But then having a timetable either literally communicated to them or in mind, so that no one is surprised when they're fired. And then you also just get it over with so that you can get someone else in.
Question for Merci, I guess kind of a classical management question, but how do you balance giving your PMs as much autonomy as possible so they have ownership and feel like they're really guiding their product versus where you step in and make decisions or guide decisions?
Oh yeah, that's a great question. Ideally you're not making decisions for your PMs. You're asking them questions that they know how to better make decisions. So I will often have, a point of view on something and run product reviews with the PMs where they come in and they update me on what's happening, and they go through their spec, or they bring questions. And then I found that it's great when you're surprised by a unique solution that they came up with, and that's really what I try to go for. So just asking them open-ended questions and saying, have you thought about this? How you ask those questions really matters. So again, that book, Never Split the Difference, will really help you nail how and what questions, because there's something very visceral that happens when your boss asks you, why did you do that, right? Even though that is a question that they want answered, right? Oh, why do you think that? Why did you do that? It feels accusatory, and you kind of seize up and stammer, as opposed to, not what were you thinking? That's another bad one, but something more how did you end up coming to this conclusion? What do you think about XYZ instead? How did you do this? Because those are really neutral, open-ended questions that really make it a conversation, even if in your mind you do have a thought you should have done A instead of B.
Amazingly, we're actually coming close to the end of our discussion here, and I hope you guys will be open for some questions if people might wander up to you and
Sure.
Shout at you in some way. But this is from Monica in the app for Ash. She asks, how do you know you found the right triggering events? What if there are multiple? How do you parse through them?
Well, if there are multiple, the best way to know which is the right one is to go in and talk to some of those people. So go in those places. And to me, sometimes triggering events are actionable. So the example I gave is, having drinks with the bar, people buying cars, your friends buying cars might influence you to buy one. That one maybe not so actionable from a marketer perspective, but what comes next could be. They might go and do some research, they might go places. That's what becomes actionable. So a lot of it is going and running interviews. The power of qualitative learning is that clustering happens very, very quickly. if you've done any usability test, you see that studies have shown the first 5 people give you the most 80% or some of the learning. Similarly with the clustering, I'll pick those triggering events you have. I guarantee they're not 24, they're a handful. So go and talk to some of those folks, and you will see some clusterings. Your insights will get better, and you will naturally gravitate towards some that you think are more actionable.
Thank you. All right, let's squeeze one more question in from the audience. Yeah, you were itching.
Sure. I had a question of how you would apply this to the B2B space, where the buyer is different from the user, so you're sort of serving two masters.
Yeah, so if you have a multi-sided market, whether it's B2B or marketplace, you do have to look at both perspectives. And then let's just stick with B2B. In the B2B context, typically there's a buyer who's buying something. You have to understand the nature in which buying happens. A lot of buying happens bottoms up. So if you use Slack, a lot of it, I'm guessing, there's users using it, and then it trickles up, and then there's a buyer, and then maybe over time, strategy changes, and you go top down. But you will need to figure out the environment you're in, and then figure out what are some of the triggers. And in B2B, there are triggers too. So if you're in HR, hiring that 100th employee might make your old payroll system hit its limits. And so now all of a sudden, that person doesn't go off the next day and buy something, but they're now open to doing some research. So you want to kind of figure out triggers for the buyer if that's the channel you're going to. Or triggers for the user. If you're looking at the developer market, maybe they're using a tool, and then again, there's something that happens. They hit their 1 millionth user, and all of a sudden, the open source product they were using kind of crumbles and hits its limits. That's a triggering event for a developer. So again, you want to go there and place your solution or explore that a bit more. So the short answer is that you probably will have two perspectives if they're both players involved, but sometimes it's with a lot of SaaS, for instance, a lot of it starts off bottoms up. So you start with just the user perspective and find triggers there, get your product adopted, and then the buyers would come along. And other cases, it could be the other way around.
Excellent. All right, well, thank you so much, everybody, for being a part of this. A round of applause, please, for Merci, Victoria, Grace, and Ash Maurya. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.